Picture a world with no lawyers, no courtrooms, and no legal jargon, only the echoing silence of a medieval hall where justice was not argued, but declared through powerful ceremonies that bound entire communities together. These were the banishment rituals of feudal Europe, solemn practices that served as the very foundation of order and morality long before modern legal systems ever took shape. In an age where written laws were rare and professional advocates non-existent, societies turned to something far more primal and profound: collective oaths, symbolic gestures, and public acts of exclusion that resonated with spiritual weight and social meaning. This was justice felt in the bones of every villager, witnessed under the open sky, and sealed not with a signature, but with a shared understanding of right and wrong. What's truly remarkable is how these rituals went far beyond simple punishment. They wove the fabric of community itself. Every act of banishment served a dual purpose. It removed a threat while reinforcing the values that held people together. Imagine standing among your neighbors as someone was formally cast out, not by a distant judge, but through the voices and gestures of those you knew and trusted. There was something raw and real about these proceedings, an emotional gravity that connected everyday life to deeper questions of honor, belonging, and divine will. It's a dimension of justice we've largely lost today, buried under layers of procedure and professionalization, yet it speaks to a universal human need for meaning and moral order. In this video, we'll journey back to uncover how these forgotten rituals worked and why they mattered. We'll explore the solemn oaths that cut people off from protection, the symbolic acts that made exile tangible, and the public shaming that served as both punishment and warning. You'll see how communities relied on these practices to resolve conflicts, maintain social cohesion, and navigate the delicate balance between authority and fairness. And perhaps most importantly, you'll discover what these ancient traditions can teach us about justice today, about who we include, who we exclude, and how we decide what's right. This isn't just a story about the past. It's a reflection on how societies have always sought to uphold order, belonging, and meaning. So join me as we step into the world of feudal courts, where justice was ritual and every act carried the weight of a community's soul. To understand the power these rituals held, we must first step away from our modern conception of law as something written, standardized, and argued by professionals. Justice in the early medieval period was not found in law books but in the living memory of the community. It was a tapestry woven from local customs, oral traditions passed down through generations, and the immediate authority of the local lord or a council of elders. Imagine a time without a standing police force, without a centralized government issuing uniform laws for an entire kingdom. In this world, maintaining order was a deeply local and personal affair. The feudal court, or Holmut, was not a grand building but a gathering, often outdoors or in the lord's great hall, where everyone from the blacksmith to the farmer had a voice. These were not passive spectators, they were active participants in a process that determined the fate of their neighbors. Their collective memory was the law library, their shared sense of right and wrong the legal code. Disputes over land, property, or personal injuries were settled not by citing precedent but by appealing to what everyone knew to be the custom of the manor, the ancient way of doing things. This system emerged from sheer necessity. With the collapse of Roman imperial administration, communities were left to fend for themselves, developing their own mechanisms for resolving conflict and deterring wrongdoing. They relied on a common understanding of honor, shame, and mutual obligation. A judgment wasn't considered successful merely because it punished a guilty party. It was successful if it restored peace and balance to the community, reinforcing the fragile social bonds that held everyone together. This is the essential context that makes banishment rituals so profound. They were the ultimate tool in this system. Exiling someone was not just about removing a criminal. It was a dramatic, public reaffirmation of the values the community held dear. It was a collective act of self-definition, a way of saying, "This is who we are, and this person, by their actions, has placed themselves outside of us." The ritual gave weight and finality to that exclusion, transforming a social decision into a tangible, unforgettable event. This collective spirit of justice meant that every decision carried the weight of shared responsibility. When a dispute arose, it wasn't handed off to a specialized class of legal experts. Instead, the entire community became both jury and witness. Picture the scene. A dispute over stolen livestock would bring everyone to the manor court, where the accuser and the accused stood before their neighbors. These weren't anonymous faces in a crowd. They were people who had known each other for generations, who had worked the same fields, celebrated the same holidays, and shared in the same hardships. Their judgments were rooted in this deep personal knowledge. They knew who had a temper, who was honest, whose family had a history of trouble. This wasn't about abstract legal principles. It was about the lived reality of their shared existence. The goal was always to restore balance, to mend the tear in the social fabric caused by the conflict. A verdict wasn't considered successful if it only punished the guilty. It had to feel right to the community, to leave people with a sense that harmony had been restored. This is why rituals like banishment were such powerful public spectacles. They were designed to be seen, heard, and felt by everyone. A private punishment might remove a problem individual, but a public ritual of exclusion taught a lasting lesson. It visually and emotionally reinforced the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Imagine the entire village gathered as someone was formally cast out. The solemn words of the oath, the symbolic gestures of rejection, these acts created a shared memory, a story that would be retold for years. It served as a stark warning to anyone else who might consider breaking the community's trust. The fear wasn't just of being caught, it was of facing the collective disapproval of everyone you knew, of being utterly and permanently severed from the only world you had ever known. This social pressure was often a far more effective deterrent than any physical punishment. Without lawyers to argue technicalities or written laws to provide loopholes, justice flowed from a common understanding of morality. This shared moral compass was shaped by tradition, religion, and the practical needs of survival. What was right was what kept the community safe and functioning. This system placed immense importance on reputation and honor. A person's word and their standing among their peers were their most valuable assets. In such a world, the court gathering was not an interruption of normal life. It was a vital part of it, a recurring ceremony where the community reaffirmed its identity and its values. The act of coming together to judge one of their own ultimately strengthened the bonds between those who remained, creating a clearer sense of us by defining what lay beyond the boundaries. Among these powerful communal practices, the oath of exclusion stands out as one of the most foundational and spiritually charged rituals. This was not a simple declaration but a solemn, binding vow that severed an individual from the very fabric of their community. Imagine the scene, the entire village gathered in the town square or before the Lord's manor, forming a silent circle around the central figures. The air would be thick with a palpable gravity, for what was about to occur was as much a spiritual severance as a legal one. The ritual typically began with a formal recitation of the offender's transgression. not merely to accuse but to establish a public record of why the community's covenant was being broken. Then the oath itself would be sworn. In some cases, the accused might be forced to swear their own outcasting, a final, cruel twist that emphasized their acceptance of the judgment. More commonly, it was the lord or a community elder who would voice the vow, with the assembled witnesses giving their collective assent through a unified response or a solemn silence that spoke volumes. The power of this oath stemmed from a deeply held belief that spoken words, especially vows made in a public forum, carried immense weight and tangible consequences. This wasn't just a social contract, it was a spiritual one. In a world where divine forces were seen as active participants in daily life, to break such an oath was to invite supernatural retribution. A curse was not merely a wish for misfortune, it was understood as a channel through which divine justice would manifest. The community wasn't just casting someone out, they were actively calling upon higher powers to witness and enforce the decree, ensuring the exile would be upheld by both man and God. This belief made the ritual terrifyingly effective. An exiled individual knew that to return or to seek aid from their former neighbors was not just a social faux pas, it was a transgression that could bring misfortune upon anyone who dared to help them, turning the entire community into enforcers of the divine will. The specific wording of these oaths was often formulaic and rich with symbolic meaning. They might formally revoke the frith or peace of the community, declaring that the individual was now outside its protection. This was a death sentence in everything but name. Without the frith, a person had no legal identity. They could not bring a complaint to court, they could not inherit property, and perhaps most chillingly, they could be harmed or even killed with impunity, as no one would be held accountable for an act against an unprotected non-person. The oath transformed a citizen into a ghost, legally and socially erased from existence. By participating in this ritual, every witness became a guarantor of this new, harrowing reality. Their collective voice didn't just describe the exclusion, it performed it, making the banishment a concrete and irreversible fact through the very act of speaking it aloud. This demonstrates the profound authority that communal agreement held, an authority so potent it could unmake a person's place in the world with words alone. If the oath of exclusion was the verbal and spiritual severance, then the symbolic casting out was its physical and unforgettable enactment. This ritual transformed the abstract concept of banishment into a stark, sensory experience that everyone present could see and feel. It wasn't enough to simply declare someone an outcast. The community needed to perform the act of expulsion, making the invisible boundaries of belonging brutally visible. Picture the solemn procession that would often follow the swearing of the oath. The condemned individual, now stripped of their legal identity, would be physically escorted to the very edge of the community's territory, a boundary that was as much psychological as it was geographical. This journey itself was a powerful part of the ritual, a slow, public march past the homes and faces they would never see again, engraving the lesson of their transgression on the hearts of every witness. The final act at the border was rich with layered meaning. In some regions, the lord or a community elder would take a clod of earth or a handful of dust and cast it at the offender's feet or over their head. This wasn't an act of mere mockery, it was profoundly symbolic. By throwing the very soil of the homeland, they were physically rejecting the individual from the land itself, revoking their right to till it, walk upon it, or be buried in it. That handful of dust represented all the sustenance, security, and identity that the land provided. In other traditions, small stones might be thrown, each one representing a member of the community, adding their personal condemnation to the collective judgment. These gestures turned intangible social exile into a tangible, physical reality, perhaps one of the most potent symbols was the crossing of a threshold. The offender might be made to step over a wooden staff laid on the ground, walk across a shallow trench dug specifically for the purpose, or wade across a small stream. These boundaries, the staff, the trench, the water, served as a literal line between two worlds. On one side was the ordered world of law, community, and safety. On the other was the wilderness, a lawless space of danger and isolation. The simple act of taking that step was a performative magic. It was the moment the person ceased to be a member of the community and became an outsider. For everyone watching, the image of that lone figure crossing the line was a memory designed to last a lifetime, a vivid deterrent against breaking the trust that bound them all together. This emphasis on powerful, simple symbolism ensured that the authority of feudal justice wasn't just heard in words, but was seen, felt, and remembered in the mind of every single person. While the oath gave words to the banishment and the symbolic casting provided a physical action, the third ritual infused the entire proceeding with an undeniable, celestial authority through the use of sacred objects. This was the moment the community's judgment was elevated from a mere human decision to a divine decree. In a world where the spiritual and secular were deeply intertwined, the courtroom or town square could be instantly transformed into a sacred space with the introduction of a single, powerful item. A Bible, a fragment of a saint's bone encased in a reliquary, a simple wooden cross, or a vessel of holy water. These were not props. They were conduits to the divine, believed to hold immense power and to demand absolute truth. The presence of such an object fundamentally changed the nature of the event for everyone involved. For the judges and the community, it was a sobering reminder that they were not acting alone. Their judgment was now witnessed and sanctioned by a higher power, which placed a heavy burden of righteousness upon their shoulders. It was a check against corrupt or biased judgments, as a wrongful condemnation performed in the presence of a sacred relic was thought to invite divine wrath upon the entire community. For the accused, the object was utterly terrifying. To lie while touching a Bible or to swear a false oath over a relic was to gamble with one's immortal soul, a risk far greater than any earthly punishment. This psychological pressure was a powerful tool for extracting confessions or establishing facts in the absence of forensic evidence. One common practice was to have the accused swear an oath of innocence upon the sacred object. The act of physically touching the Bible or the reliquary during the oath was believed to bind the speaker to absolute truth, with perjury resulting in damnation. If they were found guilty, their punishment was thus not just for the crime itself, but for the compounded sin of lying before God. Alternatively, the ritual of denunciation might be performed toward the object. The elder or lord would proclaim the offender's crimes while facing the cross or the Bible, effectively presenting the case before God as the ultimate judge and seeking divine approval for the sentence of banishment. In some regions, the act of banishment itself was sanctified. The offender might be sprinkled with holy water not as a blessing, but as a perverse form of purification, washing the community clean of their presence before casting them out into the spiritual wilderness. This fusion of sacred and secular power made the verdict feel irrevocable. A judgment delivered by a lord could perhaps be appealed to a higher noble, but a judgment witnessed and endorsed by God through his sacred objects was considered final and absolute. There was no court of appeals in heaven for a banishment sanctified by a relic. This gave the ritual an overwhelming sense of finality and righteousness, ensuring the exiled individual was shunned completely, as aiding them could be seen as defying God's will. The sacred object acted as the ultimate seal of authority, transforming a social exile into a spiritual outlaw, condemned by both their community and their creator. But the rituals of exclusion were not always silent or solemn. Some of the most potent involved a deafening chorus of communal condemnation. Public denunciation and shaming turned the abstract sentence of banishment into a visceral, emotionally charged spectacle designed to dismantle a person's standing within the community long before they were ever physically removed. This was justice as theater, a powerful performance where the entire village played a role in stripping away the offender's social identity. Imagine the accused being forced to stand upon a raised platform or in the stocks at the center of the market square, becoming the focal point of everyone's attention and disdain. They might be made to wear a distinctive garment, a coarse, hooded cloak of a specific color, or perhaps a heavy wooden mask grotesquely carved to represent their vice, like the gossiper's mask with an impossibly long tongue or the drunkard's mask with a bloated, red face. This costuming was a critical part of the ritual. It visually marked them as an outsider, a living cautionary tale for all to see. The true power of this ritual, however, lay in the voices of the crowd. This wasn't a monologue delivered by a judge, but a participatory event where community members were actively encouraged to voice their disapproval. Neighbors and even former friends would step forward to recount the individual's misdeeds, shouting insults or throwing symbolic, though not always harmful, objects like rotten vegetables or mud. This collective vocal rejection served a profound psychological purpose. It transformed the sentence from a top-down decree by the Lord into a bottom-up affirmation by the community itself. Every shout, every jeer was a reaffirmation of the shared values the offender had violated. The emotional impact on the condemned was devastating. They weren't just losing their freedom or their home, they were witnessing the complete and public revocation of their honor and their place within the social web. The humiliation was a form of social death, ensuring that even if they were to remain physically, their reputation and standing were irrevocably shattered. This practice was exceptionally effective in these tight-knit feudal societies precisely because a person's identity was so deeply intertwined with their reputation and their relationships. To be publicly shamed was to be robbed of the currency of social life. It served as an incredibly powerful deterrent for onlookers. The fear of facing such utter humiliation and loss of status was often a stronger motivator for good behavior than the fear of any physical punishment. Furthermore, the ritual reinforced social cohesion among those who remained. By collectively participating in the shaming of a transgressor, the community strengthened its own internal bonds, creating a clearer, more unified sense of us by defining and rejecting what was not us. The public spectacle ensured that the lesson was not lost on anyone, making justice a visible, memorable, and deeply participatory cornerstone of daily life. This concept of severing ties reaches its most profound and personal expression in the ritual of Forswearing, an act where an individual was compelled to become an active participant in their own social annihilation. Unlike the public shaming where the community directed its scorn, or the oath of exclusion where authority figures pronounced judgment, Forswearing required the offender to verbally and physically renounce themselves. It was a ritual of self-exile, a forced performance where the condemned had to publicly dismantle their own identity and sever every bond of kinship and allegiance that had once defined their place in the world. The term itself, forswear, carries a heavy double meaning. It meant not only to renounce or abandon, but also to swear falsely, branding the individual as an oath breaker even as they were forced to swear this final, devastating oath. The ceremony was meticulously choreographed for maximum symbolic impact. The offender would often be brought before the assembled community and the Lord, and instructed to recite a specific, formulaic phrase of renunciation. These words were far from improvised. They were ancient, traditional, and heavy with finality. A typical declaration might be something like, "I hereby forsake the protection of my lord, the fellowship of my kin, and the comfort of my community. I become a stranger to this land and to all who dwell within it." By speaking these words aloud, the individual was not just accepting a punishment, they were performing a kind of legal and social suicide. Their voice became the instrument of their own undoing, making the rupture feel like a conscious choice, even though it was anything but. This active participation was a crucial part of the ritual's power, as it stripped away any lingering claim to victimhood and placed the responsibility for the exile squarely on their own shoulders. But words alone were often not enough. The abstract nature of renunciation had to be made physically tangible through a powerful symbolic gesture. One of the most common acts was the breaking of a staff. The staff was a near-universal symbol of authority, support, and journeying. A Lord Steward might carry a staff representing his office, a traveler would lean on a staff for aid, and a community elder might use one to signify their role. To snap that staff over one's knee or to cast it to the ground and break it was a brilliantly concise act of theater. It visually represented the breaking of the Lord's authority over the individual, and conversely, the breaking of the individual's right to the Lord's protection. It signaled that their journey within the community was over. Another potent symbol was the tossing of a glove. In medieval culture, a glove could represent a pledge, a challenge, or a person's identity. Knights would receive back their gloves after doing homage to their lord as a sign of the bond between them. To throw a glove to the ground before the lord was to violently reject that bond, an ultimate gesture of defiance that was all the more powerful because it was coerced. In some regions, the ritual involved stepping over a weapon or a tool associated with their trade, symbolizing their abandonment of their role and their means of sustenance. Each of these gestures translated the complex, invisible web of feudal obligations into a single, unforgettable image that everyone present could understand, regardless of their literacy or social standing. The true genius of the Forswearing ritual lay in its creation of a mutual and seemingly irrevocable agreement. By compelling the offender to perform these acts, the community and the authority figure were not just imposing a sentence, they were orchestrating a mutual acknowledgement of the rupture. The Lord received the thrown glove, the community witnessed the broken staff. This performative contract made reconciliation exceptionally difficult. One couldn't simply sneak back into the territory or beg for forgiveness after a few years. To return would require another formal, public ritual to undo the one that had been performed, a humbling act of contrition that was rarely offered and even more rarely accepted. The Forswearing ritual therefore acted as a permanent lock on the door, thrown from the inside by the person being cast out. It demonstrated with stunning clarity that in a world without complex legal codes, justice relied on these stark, performative acts to make a decision feel as concrete and unchangeable as a broken piece of wood lying in the dust. To grasp why a banishment ritual in a 12th century English manor felt so terrifyingly final, we must journey back even further to the dense forests and tribal assemblies of pre-medieval Germania. The concept of justice these early peoples developed was not centered on prisons or fines, but on a single, devastating punishment, outlawry. This was the primordial ancestor of feudal banishment, a practice so harsh and absolute that its DNA is still visible in the rituals we've already explored. For a Germanic tribesman, to be declared an outlaw, or fridlos meaning peaceless, was a fate arguably worse than execution. It was a complete nullification of their existence within the legal and spiritual community. The decree meant that all bonds of kinship were severed, all oaths of protection rendered void. An outlaw could be harmed, robbed, or killed by anyone without fear of retaliation or blood feud from their former kin. They were, in the most literal sense, a wolf among men, outside the law, beyond its protection, and fair game for anyone. This ancient concept of peace was not simply the absence of violence. It was a positive, active state of being under the protection of the law and the community. To be stripped of this peace was to be cast into a spiritual and physical wilderness. The rituals surrounding this declaration were direct and brutal. In some traditions, the outlaw might be symbolically chased from the tribal assembly with shouts and curses, their name condemned to be forgotten. The key element here was the communal proclamation. The entire tribe or its representatives would witness and affirm the sentence, making the outcasting a collective act of will. This wasn't a judgment handed down by a remote authority. It was the voice of the people renouncing one of their own, a practice that directly foreshadowed the participatory nature of the later feudal courts. When the structures of the Roman Empire crumbled, these Germanic tribal customs did not disappear. Instead, they flowed into the vacuum, merging with the remnants of Roman law and later with Christian doctrine to form the bedrock of medieval feudal justice. The feudal lord, in many ways, stepped into the role once occupied by the tribal chieftain or assembly. The manor court became the new thing or assembly ground. And the old, terrifying punishment of outlawry was seamlessly adapted into the new feudal context. The lord's authority to grant peace and protection to those who swore allegiance to him inherently contained its dark inverse, the power to withdraw that peace, to declare someone outside his protection. The solemn oath of exclusion we discussed earlier is a direct descendant of the tribal declaration of outlawry, now sanctified by Christian oaths and feudal hierarchy. The symbolic casting out, where an individual was physically escorted to the territorial boundary, echoes the ancient practice of being chased from the tribal lands into the unknown forest. This blending of old and new created a powerful hybrid system. The feudal court retained the communal, participatory spirit of the tribal assembly, where judgment required the consent and witness of the community. Yet it layered onto that the more structured, land-based authority of the feudal lord. The punishment was no longer just expulsion from a tribe, but also expulsion from a specific territory, from the land that the lord controlled and the tenant worked. This historical lineage explains the profound resilience and emotional weight of these rituals. They were not arbitrary inventions of the Middle Ages. They were ancient practices repurposed for a new world, carrying with them centuries of cultural meaning and primal fear. The rituals worked because they tapped into a very old, deeply ingrained understanding of what it meant to belong and the catastrophic consequences of being cast out. While the entire community played a vital part in these rituals, the entire process was orchestrated and given its ultimate authority by a single, pivotal figure, the feudal lord or local magistrate. This individual was far more than a mere administrator. They were the living embodiment of the law within their domain, a role that blended judge, military leader, and spiritual guardian into one. Unlike a modern judge who remains a detached arbiter behind a bench, the Lord was an active, physical participant in the drama of justice. He didn't just observe the oath of exclusion. He was often the one to speak the damning words, his voice carrying the weight of his station. He didn't merely sentence someone to be cast out. He might personally lead the procession to the boundary line or cast the first handful of dust. This direct involvement was crucial, as it transformed an abstract legal concept into a tangible act of power that everyone could see and respect. His presence legitimized the entire proceeding, signaling that this was not a mere mob action but a sanctioned act of communal self-defense, backed by the full authority of the manor. Yet this authority was not absolute or exercised in a vacuum. A wise lord understood that his power was ultimately dependent on the consent and cooperation of the very community he governed. His court was not a sealed chamber but an open forum, and the murmurs of the crowd, the testimony of neighbors, and the general consensus of the elders held immense sway. A judgment that felt deeply unjust or arbitrary to the people could breed resentment, undermine the Lord's authority, and even spark open defiance. Therefore, the rituals we've discussed served a dual purpose for the Lord. They were a display of his power, but also a mechanism for gauging and channeling the will of the community. By presiding over a public shaming or a ritual of forswearing, he was effectively rubber-stamping a verdict that had already been reached by collective sentiment, aligning his executive power with the popular will. This created a delicate and fascinating balance, a form of collaborative governance where top-down authority and bottom-up consent met in the symbolic space of the ritual. This dynamic meant the Lord had to be a skilled reader of people and politics. His role was less about discovering absolute truth through evidence and more about managing relationships and restoring equilibrium. A dispute between two powerful families required a different approach than a case involving a penniless serf. Sometimes, the ritual itself could be manipulated for political ends. A lord might use the threat of banishment to neutralize a rival or confiscate desirable land, using the ritual's solemnity to cloak a self-serving move in the garb of righteous justice. Conversely, he might bow to public pressure to banish a widely disliked individual, even if the evidence was thin, simply to maintain peace and order. This interplay shows that feudal justice was never a pure system of right and wrong. It was a pragmatic tool for maintaining stability, where the Lord acted as both a conductor of the community's moral orchestra and a soloist whose own power and interests always had to be heard. His ultimate success was measured not in the perfection of every verdict, but in the long-term survival and cohesion of the entire social order over which he presided. Nowhere was the chilling finality of these rituals more starkly illustrated than in medieval England, where the ancient concept of outlawry was refined into a terrifyingly efficient legal tool. The most extreme and feared declaration was that of wolf's head or caput lupinum. To be declared a wolf's head was to be placed in a category beyond mere exile. It was a sentence that stripped a person of all humanity in the eyes of the law. The term itself is brutally evocative. Just as any hunter could legally kill a wolf for the good of the community, so too could any person slay the outlaw without fear of facing murder charges themselves. The individual was legally transformed from a subject of the king into a dangerous beast, an enemy to all and a friend to none. This wasn't just banishment, it was a state-sanctioned hunt, a license to kill issued to the entire population. This ultimate penalty was typically reserved for the most severe threats to the social and political order. Repeated and violent offenders who had evaded capture, those accused of treason against the crown, or individuals who had failed to appear in court after being summoned multiple times could all find themselves facing this grim fate. The process of declaring someone a wolf's head was not undertaken lightly. It was a formal legal procedure initiated in a royal court. A specific type of writ would be issued, a powerful document bearing the authority of the king himself. This writ would then be sent to the sheriffs of the relevant counties, who were responsible for its public proclamation. The proclamation itself was a powerful ritual designed to ensure no one could plead ignorance. The sheriff or his crier would announce the writ in the most public spaces available, at the local market cross on a busy trading day, at the steps of the church after Sunday Mass, or at the county court itself. The wording was precise and terrifying. It would name the offender, describe their crimes in damning detail, and formally declare them caput lupinum. The ritual often included symbolic acts to drive the point home. The writ might be physically torn in half to symbolize the breaking of the outlaw's bond with the kingdom, or a horn might be blown to signal that the hunt was officially open. From that moment forward, the outlaw existed in a nightmarish limbo. They were cut off from all legal protection. Their property was forfeit to the crown, their marriage was dissolved, and their heirs could no longer inherit their name or lands. They could be captured or killed by anyone, and assisting them in any way by offering food, shelter, or even a kind word was itself a criminal act, rendering the helper an accomplice and potentially subject to the same dreadful punishment. The case of the infamous Hereward the Wake, a Saxon noble who led a rebellion against Norman rule following the conquest of 1066, provides a vivid, though complex, example. While later romanticized as a folk hero, contemporary records suggest he was declared an outlaw by William the Conqueror, his lands confiscated and a price put on his head. His prolonged resistance in the fenlands of East Anglia turned him into a living legend, but his legal status was that of a man completely outside the law, a wolf's head who could be slain on sight by any of the king's men. A more straightforward and tragic case is found in the legal rolls from the reign of Henry III. In 1274, a man named John de Audley was accused of murder. He failed to appear in court to answer the charges after being summoned 4 times. The court's response was swift and final. He was declared an outlaw and a wolf's head. His name was recorded in the bleak, administrative Latin of the court rolls, a permanent testament to his complete erasure from the community of the realm. These cases show how the ritual of outlawry was not just a dramatic spectacle, but a fully integrated component of the English common law system, a terrifyingly effective means of maintaining order when all other methods of control had failed. Across the Rhine and into the heart of continental Europe, the rituals of banishment took on fascinating new forms, shaped by a unique historical alchemy. Here, the legacy of the Roman Empire's highly codified law bumped up against the vibrant, oral customs of Germanic and Frankish tribes, all while being filtered through the powerful, unifying lens of the Christian Church. This created a tapestry of justice that was both incredibly diverse and strangely consistent in its core purpose. While England refined the stark declaration of outlawry, mainland Europe often expressed exile through even richer, more theatrical symbolism, weaving the sentence into the very fabric of communal and religious life. Consider the ritual of breaking a sword, a practice documented in some German territories. In a society where a man's honor, his role as a warrior, and his very identity were often tied to his weapon, this was a punishment of profound degradation. The ceremony wasn't merely about destroying a tool, it was about annihilating a status. The condemned man, often a knight or freeman who had violated his oath of fealty, would be brought before his peers. The lord or judge would then take the man's own sword, the instrument of his protection and power, and snap it across his knee or shatter it against a stone. The sharp crack of breaking steel would echo through the silent assembly, a sound that symbolized the irreversible breaking of the bond between the lord and his vassal. It was a physical, audible, and deeply humiliating act that made the loss of honor terrifyingly concrete. This ritual spoke directly to the warrior ethos of Germanic culture, transforming the legal concept of exile into a visceral loss of manhood and standing. In parts of medieval France, particularly in the south, banishment could be timed to coincide with the most important events in the communal calendar, such as religious festivals or annual fairs. This practice amplified the psychological impact to an almost unbearable degree. Imagine the entire town gathered for a vibrant Pentecost celebration or the feast day of the local patron saint, a time of joy, renewal, and reinforced community bonds. At the height of the festivities, the mood would suddenly shift. The authorities would present the condemned individual, forcing them to become a dark counterpoint to the celebration. Their expulsion was performed amidst the laughter and music, making their exclusion feel all the more absolute and poignant. Cast out during a time of maximum togetherness, they became the ultimate outsider. This timing was a masterstroke of psychological theater, ensuring that every future celebration for those who remained would carry a faint memory of the price of transgressing the community's rules, forever linking joy with the fear of its loss. The influence of the Church added another profound layer to these continental practices. In many regions, the line between civic banishment and religious excommunication became dangerously blurred. A person cast out by the Lord's court might also be denied the sacraments by the local priest, severing their hope not only for an earthly future but for a heavenly one. The ritual might involve the ringing of a bell or the closing of a church door in the offender's face, symbolizing that their soul was now as exiled as their body. This fusion of spiritual and temporal punishment created a truly comprehensive form of exile, offering the condemned no refuge in this world or the next. It demonstrated how completely the medieval world intertwined daily life with the divine, and how justice could leverage the deepest fears of the human spirit to enforce its earthly decrees. By comparing these regional variations, the Germanic sword breaking, the French festive expulsions, the Church's spiritual sanctions, we see a brilliant adaptability at work. Communities were not blindly following a single manual of justice. They were creatively using the cultural tools at their disposal. They crafted rituals that resonated with their specific values, whether those were martial honor, communal joy, or religious piety. Yet, beneath this dazzling diversity, the ultimate goal remained unchanged: to reaffirm the community's values in the most powerful way possible. Whether through the crack of a sword or the slam of a church door, the message was identical. This was who we were, this was what we believed, and you, by your actions, have chosen to no longer be a part of us. Imagine the sheer, gut-wrenching terror that must have gripped a person standing at the edge of their known world, watching the faces of everyone they had ever known turn away in a unified, silent judgment. For a medieval individual, banishment was a psychological cataclysm far more devastating than any physical hardship. It was an existential erasure. In a society where a person's identity was inextricably woven from their relationships, their land, and their role within a tightly knit community, to be cast out was to be unmade. This wasn't merely a change of address, it was the annihilation of the self. The rituals we've described, the oaths, the casting out, the shaming, were meticulously designed to maximize this profound psychological devastation, transforming a legal sentence into a living nightmare that haunted not just the condemned but every single witness. The most immediate and terrifying consequence was the complete loss of what the Anglo-Saxons called frith, the peace and protection of the community. Without frith, you were utterly exposed. This concept is almost alien to us today with our state police forces and legal safeguards. In the medieval world, there was no safety net. Your ability to live, to work, to simply exist without being robbed or murdered depended entirely on your membership in a group that owed you protection. The moment that protection was ritually revoked, you became prey. A farmer could no longer tend his fields without fear of being driven off. A craftsman lost all his customers and his right to work in the guild. A mother and father were torn from their children with no hope of ever seeing them again. This wasn't just losing your home, it was losing your very right to have a home anywhere. The wilderness beyond the village boundary was not just physically dangerous, filled with wild animals and harsh elements. It was a moral and legal vacuum where the rules of humanity no longer applied. This isolation struck at the core of a medieval person's spiritual identity. We live in a largely secular age, but for them, the divine was a daily, palpable presence. The community was not just a social unit, it was a congregation. To be banished was to be severed from the rites and rituals that connected you to God and gave life its meaning. You could no longer attend Mass, receive the sacraments, or be buried in consecrated ground. Your soul was in peril. The rituals often emphasized this, incorporating religious symbols to make it clear that banishment was also a form of excommunication. The fear of eternal damnation was a potent, terrifying force that made earthly exile feel like a prelude to hell itself. The psychological weight of being cast out by both your neighbors and your God created a loneliness so absolute it was unimaginable until experienced. And this was precisely the point. The sheer, overwhelming dread of this fate was the engine that made the entire system work. The public, ritualized nature of banishment was a masterclass in psychological deterrence. It wasn't a private affair handled in a closed courtroom. It was a spectacle. Every villager, from the smallest child to the eldest elder, was meant to see it, feel it, and remember it. They witnessed the raw grief and terror on the face of the condemned. They participated in the shouts of scorn or stood in the heavy silence of the oath swearing. They watched the symbolic casting out, a visual image designed to burn itself into memory. This created a powerful, shared trauma that reinforced social norms more effectively than any written law. The unspoken message to everyone was clear and terrifying. This could be you. This is the price of breaking our trust. The fear of becoming that shunned, lonely figure on the road was a more powerful incentive for good behavior than the fear of a whip or a stockade. This deep-seated primal fear explains why these rituals persisted for centuries with such little change. They worked on a fundamental human level. They targeted our most basic instincts, the need to belong, the need for security, and the need for meaning. A modern prison sentence, for all its harshness, offers a strange kind of certainty, a defined term, regular meals, a roof overhead. Medieval banishment offered none of that. It was an open-ended sentence of uncertainty, danger, and profound loneliness. It traded physical walls for psychological ones that were infinitely more effective and impossible to escape. The genius of these feudal systems was their understanding that to control a community, you didn't just need to punish the body, you had to command the mind and the soul. Yet for all their harsh finality, these rituals of exclusion were never just about the individual being cast out. In a profound and almost paradoxical way, they were a powerful mechanism for building up the community that remained. Every public act of banishment served a dual purpose. It removed a perceived threat while simultaneously performing a kind of social magic, reforging the bonds between everyone who witnessed it. Think of it not as a simple act of subtraction, but as a complex equation of social calculus. By collectively defining and expelling what they were not, the community arrived at a much clearer, stronger understanding of who they were. This process transformed justice from an abstract concept into a tangible, shared experience. The principles that governed their lives, loyalty, honesty, respect for property and person, were often unspoken, simply part of the background hum of daily existence. But when someone violated these norms, the ritual that followed pulled those values out of the background and placed them center stage, under the spotlight of communal attention. The recitation of the crimes, the solemn swearing of oaths, the symbolic gestures of rejection, each step was a powerful reminder of the rules that allowed them to live together in relative peace. It was a live morality play, a dramatic reinforcement of the social contract that everyone had a stake in upholding. For a community with no written legal code, these rituals were the living, breathing textbook of their law, and everyone was required to attend the lecture. The very act of participating, whether by voicing approval, standing in silent witness, or simply being present, was crucial. This shared experience created a powerful sense of collective responsibility and identity. After casting out a thief, every villager felt a renewed commitment to the principle of property rights. After banishing a violent offender, everyone felt a deeper investment in maintaining peace. They had all participated in a difficult but necessary act, and having done it together, they left the ritual more unified than before. It was a stressful, emotional event that, in its aftermath, actually lowered social tensions by providing a clear, decisive resolution and reaffirming the group's ability to handle crises. The community proved to itself that it could endure a breach of its norms and emerge intact, even strengthened. This resilience was the ultimate goal. The ritual was a vaccine against social chaos. It introduced a controlled dose of conflict and punishment to build up the community's immunity against larger, more devastating breakdowns. By periodically performing this act of collective self-definition, they maintained the social cohesion that was their only real defense against the uncertainties of the medieval world. The exiled individual became a sacrifice on the altar of community stability, their loss serving as the glue that mended the social fabric for everyone else. Yet for all their profound psychological power and deep social utility, these intricate rituals of communal justice could not withstand the relentless tide of change sweeping across Europe. The decline of ritual banishment was not a sudden collapse but a slow erosion, a fundamental reshaping of society itself that gradually made these ancient practices seem obsolete. The driving force behind this transformation was the rise of the centralized state, a new political entity that sought to consolidate power and impose a uniform rule of law across entire kingdoms. Kings and their growing bureaucracies began to view the local, custom-based justice of the manor courts not as a vital communal function, but as a challenge to their own authority. Why should a local lord have the power to cast someone out of the kingdom's protection when that power rightly belonged to the crown? This shift in perspective was monumental. Justice was increasingly seen not as a process for restoring local harmony, but as a mechanism for enforcing the king's peace, a peace that was now defined by written statutes, not oral traditions. This new system demanded new professionals. The emergence of lawyers was a death knell for ritual justice. These were individuals trained in the complexities of royal law, adept at navigating written codes and legal procedures that were entirely separate from the communal customs of the village. A dispute was no longer a matter for the whole community to resolve through collective memory and symbolic action. It became a technical contest to be argued by experts in a royal court using standardized evidence and precedent. The law was becoming a specialized science, accessible only to those with the education and resources to engage its practitioners. This professionalization created a growing distance between the people and the process of justice. Where once every villager had a voice and a role, they were now increasingly relegated to the status of spectators or subjects in a legal drama controlled by the state and its agents. The tools of justice changed to match this new philosophy. Written laws, court records, and formal warrants began to replace the spoken oath and the symbolic gesture. A banishment order was no longer proclaimed by a lord before his assembled people and sanctified by a relic. It was now a piece of parchment, sealed with the king's wax seal and delivered by a royal official. This document might be read aloud, but the ritual was gone. The power now resided in the text itself, in the impersonal authority of the state, not in the collective will of the community made manifest through ceremony. This shift towards written, standardized law offered undeniable benefits. It promised greater consistency and reduced the risk of arbitrary judgments based on local prejudice or a lord's whim. But this gain in efficiency and uniformity came at a cost. the law was becoming less participatory, less rooted in the immediate social context, and far less effective as a tool for building communal solidarity. Justice was becoming something done to people, not something they did together. Yet it is fascinating to see how the human need for ritual and public reckoning refused to vanish completely. Elements of these ancient practices persisted, stubbornly clinging on in new forms. Public punishments, for instance, became spectacles of state power rather than communal catharsis. The pillory, the stocks, and public executions drew large crowds, but the purpose had changed. These events were no longer about the community reaffirming its values. They were about the state demonstrating its terrifying power to punish and control. Similarly, the Church's practice of excommunication retained the old ritual structure: the bell, the book, and the candle. To cast someone out of the spiritual community, a powerful echo of secular banishment that continued to wield immense psychological force long after the Lord's court had lost its authority to exile. This great transition from community-based ritual to state-controlled system represents a pivotal moment in our legal history. It marks the point where we began to trade the deep, emotional, and socially cohesive aspects of justice for the benefits of efficiency, standardization, and centralized control. We gained a system that was, in theory, more fair and impartial, but we lost one that was deeply meaningful and personally resonant for every member of society. The story of this decline is not just about the disappearance of old practices. It is about the fundamental restructuring of how we relate to law, authority, and each other. Yet the transition from these deeply communal rituals to our modern legal framework represents one of the most profound shifts in how societies conceive of justice. Today, we place our trust in a system of professional lawyers, standardized evidence, and courtrooms presided over by impartial judges, a world governed by written codes and procedural rules rather than collective oaths and public symbolism. This evolution towards legal professionalism has undoubtedly brought immense benefits: greater consistency in verdicts, protections against arbitrary power, and a focus on individual rights that shields citizens from the sometimes tyrannical whims of the crowd. We have traded the visceral public spectacle for the quiet, methodical examination of facts, prioritizing fairness and objectivity over the emotional catharsis of communal participation. But if we look closely at the edges of our modern system, we can still discern faint echoes of those ancient feudal rituals, subtle reminders of our enduring need for public reckoning and communal healing. Consider the modern phenomenon of the public apology, often delivered on a grand stage through media platforms. A corporate executive, a celebrity, or a public official stands before the court of public opinion to acknowledge wrongdoing, express remorse, and seek reintegration into the community's good graces. While not a formal legal proceeding, this ritual serves a strikingly similar social function to the public shaming of old. It is a performative act meant to restore a broken trust and reaffirm shared values, with the audience's acceptance acting as the ultimate verdict. Even more directly, the growing restorative justice movement seeks to consciously reintroduce that lost element of communal engagement. Instead of a state prosecutor facing off against a defense lawyer in a closed courtroom, restorative justice brings the victim, the offender, and affected community members together in a facilitated circle. The goal is not merely to determine guilt and assign punishment, but to openly discuss the harm caused, to understand its impact, and to collectively determine how to make amends. This process deliberately recreates the participatory, dialogue-based nature of the feudal Hallmut, aiming to repair the social fabric ruptured by the crime in a way that a prison sentence alone never could. It acknowledges that justice for many is not an abstract legal conclusion but a deeply personal need for acknowledgement and closure. The most telling difference, however, lies in what is conspicuously absent from our modern toolkit: the ritualistic, permanent severance of banishment. Our system individualizes punishment, focusing on fines, probation, or incarceration penalties that, however harsh, ultimately occur within the context of the state. The prisoner remains a citizen, retains certain rights, and upon release is theoretically permitted to rejoin society. The feudal ritual of casting someone out, of declaring them peaceless and utterly beyond the pale of community protection, is an anathema to our modern legal ethos. We have rejected the concept of total, permanent exile as barbaric, a relic of a less enlightened age. This rejection, while humane, underscores the fundamental trade-off we have made. Our system is vastly more fair and protective of individual rights, but it is also far less participatory for the average citizen. For most people, the law is now a remote, complex bureaucracy they hope to never encounter, managed by a professional class they do not understand. The profound sense of collective ownership and responsibility that was forged in the public square during a banishment ritual has been largely relinquished to the state. We have gained impartiality and professionalism, but we may have lost a sense of shared investment in the moral order of our communities, a feeling that justice is something we actively build together rather than a service provided to us by distant experts. This reflection is not a call to return to the past, but an invitation to consider what elements of that communal spirit might be woven into the fabric of our modern systems to make justice feel less like a transaction and more like a shared covenant. This popular image of medieval justice as a chaotic free-for-all, a world where might made right and punishments were dished out on a lord's cruel whim, is perhaps one of the most persistent and misleading myths we've inherited. While these societies were certainly capable of brutality, the banishment rituals we've explored were the absolute antithesis of arbitrary violence. They were meticulously structured, deeply symbolic ceremonies, governed by strict customs and designed for a very specific purpose: not to indulge cruelty, but to reaffirm the social order and restore balance to the community. To dismiss them as primitive or random is to completely miss their sophistication and their profound meaning within the medieval worldview. The key to understanding this is recognizing that these rituals were, above all else, predictable. They followed a well-known script that everyone in the community understood. The same symbolic gestures, the breaking of the staff, the casting of the dust, the swearing of the oath, were repeated again and again. This wasn't a sign of a lack of imagination, it was a sign of a robust legal tradition. The predictability provided a crucial sense of fairness and legitimacy. An accused individual knew what the process would be, what the possible outcomes were, and what the rituals would entail. This stands in stark contrast to the Hollywood image of a capricious tyrant suddenly condemning someone to the dungeons on a mere suspicion. The public, participatory nature of the rituals acted as a check on raw power, ensuring that a judgment required the witness and often the assent of the community to be considered valid and binding. Furthermore, the goal of these rituals was rarely pure retribution. Their primary function was pedagogical. They were meant to teach. Every step of the process was a lesson for the entire community. The public recitation of the crimes taught everyone what behaviors were beyond the pale. The collective participation in the shaming or the oath swearing taught everyone that upholding the law was a shared responsibility. And the final, dramatic act of exclusion taught the ultimate consequence of violating the community's trust. The ritual was a powerful tool for broadcasting and reinforcing the norms that held their fragile society together. It was a performance of justice designed to be remembered and discussed for years, serving as a far more effective deterrent than a private beating ever could. Perhaps the most significant misconception is the idea that these systems offered no hope of redemption. In many cases, banishment was not necessarily intended to be a permanent death sentence. These were small, interdependent communities, and losing a productive member was a genuine cost. Therefore, the rituals often contained built-in mechanisms for reconciliation and return. An exiled individual might be allowed to return if they could secure a powerful patron to swear an oath of peace on their behalf, essentially providing a Chinese letter for their future good behavior. They might be required to pay a weregild, a carefully calculated monetary compensation to the victim's family, to settle the blood feud and allow for reintegration. In some religious contexts, performing a pilgrimage or doing penance could serve as a path to atonement and eventual forgiveness. This possibility of return makes the ritual even more psychologically complex. It wasn't just a one-way door out of society, it was a conditional exile. The door could be unlocked, but only by the community's terms. This gave the community ongoing leverage over the exiled individual and created a powerful incentive for them to genuinely reform. It also reflects a pragmatic understanding of human fallibility and a desire to preserve social capital wherever possible. Recognizing this nuance completely transforms our view of medieval justice from a simplistic system of punishment to a far more sophisticated, communally minded process of conflict resolution and social maintenance. By setting aside the myths of mindless brutality, we can finally see these rituals for what they truly were: a profound and calculated effort to use ceremony, symbolism, and collective will to forge a stable world out of the unpredictable raw material of human nature. Yet for all their intricate design and communal purpose, these rituals of banishment were far from a perfect system of justice. They carried within them a deep and troubling ethical flaw, one that stemmed from the very thing that gave them power: their reliance on communal opinion and social standing rather than objective evidence or professional advocacy. In a society where a person's word and their reputation were their primary currency in court, those who already stood on the margins were at a devastating disadvantage. Imagine a landless peasant accused by a well-respected local farmer, or a traveling merchant with no kin in the area facing charges from a tight-knit group of villagers. Without a family network to vouch for their character or the resources to gather witnesses in their defense, their fate was often sealed long before any ritual began. The system was inherently stacked against the outsider, the poor, and the socially isolated, making the specter of wrongful banishment a grim and ever-present reality. This vulnerability was ripe for exploitation by those in positions of influence. A local lord with an eye on a desirable piece of land could use the threat of banishment to pressure a vulnerable tenant into surrendering it. A powerful family seeking to settle an old score or remove a rival could orchestrate accusations against a weaker opponent, knowing the community's tendency to side with established authority and social standing. The rituals themselves, for all their solemnity, could be manipulated into a theater of injustice. The same public shaming that was meant to condemn a genuine offender could be weaponized to destroy an innocent person's honor based on little more than rumor and malice. The absence of any formal legal counsel meant there was no one to cross-examine false witnesses, to challenge dubious evidence, or to ensure that the accused fully understood the charges against them. The process was ultimately a test of social capital, not necessarily truth. This fundamental ethical tension between the need for communal order and the risk of tyrannical injustice is not some relic confined to the past. It is a mirror held up to our own legal systems, then and now. It forces us to ask a difficult question: how does any society balance the raw need for authority and stability with the equally vital need for fairness, accountability, and protection for the most vulnerable? The feudal court answered this by prioritizing the peace of the group, sometimes at the terrible expense of the individual. Our modern systems, with their lawyers, rights of appeal, and presumption of innocence, attempt to correct for this by intentionally weighting the scales in favor of the accused, accepting that some guilty parties may go free to ensure that fewer innocent people are punished. Reflecting on this medieval dilemma invites us to critically examine our own definitions of justice. Is justice primarily about achieving a correct outcome, or is it about ensuring a fair process? The banishment rituals were overwhelmingly focused on outcome, restoring communal harmony, with process often taking a back seat. Our system, for all its flaws, strives to prioritize process, believing that a just outcome is only possible if the path to get there is scrupulously fair for everyone involved, regardless of their wealth or status. The haunting echoes of the feudal outcast, condemned by the crowd without a defender, remind us why those procedural safeguards were so painfully necessary to invent. They stand as a permanent caution against any system where justice becomes a mere extension of popular sentiment or power, rather than a shield protecting the individual from both. To truly grasp the significance of these rituals, we must see them as more than just archaic legal procedures. They are profound cultural artifacts, each one a meticulously crafted keyhole through which we can peer into the very soul of a society. A banishment ceremony was not an isolated event but a concentrated expression of a community's deepest values, its fears, and its understanding of the world's order. Every element, from the objects used to the words spoken, was a symbol loaded with shared meaning. The breaking of a staff wasn't just a piece of wood snapping, it was the visual shattering of a feudal bond. The casting of dust wasn't merely throwing dirt, it was the physical revocation of a person's right to the land that sustained them. These rituals were a language, a form of storytelling where a community acted out its most fundamental beliefs about right and wrong, belonging and exclusion, authority and obedience. By studying this symbolic language, anthropologists and historians can trace the intricate evolution of social norms and legal concepts long before they were ever written down. These performances reveal how a society defined personhood itself. In a world without the modern concept of the individual with inalienable rights, a person's identity was largely relational, derived from their connections to kin, lord, and community. Banishment, therefore, was the systematic severing of those relationships, a process that effectively made a person in the eyes of society. The ritual made this abstract, terrifying concept brutally tangible. This shows us that for medieval people, justice was not a cold application of rules but a hot, communal process of defining the boundaries of their collective self. It was a way of answering the perennial question, who are we, and what must we cast out to remain ourselves? Perhaps the most compelling evidence of their importance is their stunning persistence across wildly different cultures and eras. While the specific gestures varied, the core concept of ritualized exclusion appears again and again, from the ancient Roman practice of exilium to the Germanic declaration of outlawry, and even in practices like the Amish practice of shunning or the ancient Greek vote of ostracism. This isn't a case of one culture copying another, it is a powerful indicator of a universal human need. Across time and space, societies have felt compelled to formalize exclusion, to mark the moment of casting someone out with ceremony and gravity. This suggests that ritual is not just an add-on to justice. For much of human history, it was an essential component, the mechanism that transformed a social decision into a sacred, unassailable truth. This universal impulse transforms our understanding of these practices. They cease to be curious footnotes in legal history and become instead vital windows into the medieval mind. They reveal a worldview where the spiritual and secular were inseparable, where spoken words held tangible power, and where the community's collective will was the highest authority. The ritual was the engine that made that authority real and unforgettable. It connected the act of justice to the divine order, to the fertility of the land, and to the very survival of the group. To witness a banishment was to participate in a drama that reinforced the architecture of their entire universe. In this light, these rituals were not primitive at all, but highly sophisticated cultural technologies for maintaining order and meaning in a precarious world, offering us a breathtaking glimpse into how our ancestors navigated the eternal struggle between the individual and the group, and the profound human need to make justice something that could be seen, felt, and believed. Yet within the solemn circles of judgment and the dramatic rituals of exclusion, the experiences and roles of women were far from uniform, painting a complex picture of how gender hierarchies shaped the application of feudal justice. A woman's involvement in these proceedings was almost entirely dictated by her social standing, her marital status, and the specific cultural norms of her region. For a noblewoman, her high status might offer a layer of protection against the most severe forms of banishment, often reserved for political threats or treason. However, this same elevated position made her uniquely vulnerable to accusations of moral crimes that could bring dishonor upon a powerful family or disrupt important dynastic alliances. In these cases, the punishment was less about the act itself and more about the catastrophic social and political fallout it could cause. A noblewoman accused of adultery wasn't just violating a moral code. She was potentially jeopardizing bloodlines, inheritance, and treaty obligations, making her a candidate for being quietly removed from the court or sent to a distant convent, a form of social banishment that preserved the family's honor while still eliminating the problem. For the vast majority of women who were peasants or of low birth, the stakes were terrifyingly different. Their legal identity was often subsumed under that of their father or husband, a concept known as coverture. This meant they had little independent legal standing to defend themselves in court. An accusation from a local authority or a powerful neighbor could be nearly impossible to overcome without a male guardian to speak on their behalf. The crimes they were accused of often revolved around perceived violations of the community's moral or sexual order. A woman might be banished not for theft or violence, but for accusations of witchcraft, fornication, or being a common scold, a charge specifically applied to women deemed too quarrelsome or disruptive to the peace of the community. Her punishment was frequently a public shaming ritual designed to reinforce patriarchal control, such as being paraded in a scold's bridle before being escorted to the edge of the territory. A stark lesson to all women about the consequences of stepping outside prescribed social roles. But to view women solely as victims of these processes is to miss a crucial part of the story. Women were also active, essential participants in the theater of justice. As members of the community, their presence as witnesses was vital. Their voices, raised in the collective assent during an oath of exclusion or their shared silence during a denunciation, lent weight and legitimacy to the proceedings. In some regions, specific ritual roles were reserved for them. They might be the ones to lead the mourning laments for the condemned individual, a powerful vocal performance that underscored the profound sense of loss and social death that banishment represented. This role transformed them into the community's conscience, publicly grieving not just for the person, but for the broken social bond itself. In other cases, especially those involving accusations of witchcraft or moral failings, women were often the primary accusers, their testimony against another woman carrying significant weight in these contexts. This creates a heartbreakingly complex dynamic where women were sometimes compelled to enforce the very patriarchal norms that constrained them, participating in the destruction of another's life to safeguard their own precarious standing within the community. This intricate web of roles as potential victims, necessary witnesses, ritual mourners, and even accusers reveals that banishment was never a one-size-fits-all punishment. A woman's journey through this legal landscape was uniquely shaped by the intersection of her gender with her class, her reputation, and the local customs governing power and propriety. Her story adds a critical layer of depth to our understanding of medieval society, moving us beyond tales of knights and kings to uncover the subtle and often harsh ways social hierarchies were maintained. It shows us a legal system where the letter of the law was always interpreted through the lens of social power, and where the rituals of justice were as much about enforcing the prevailing social order as they were about addressing any individual crime. Beyond the profound social and spiritual isolation, the sentence of banishment carried an immediate and devastating economic death sentence, severing the exiled individual from the very means of survival itself. In a world where over 90% of the population lived directly off the land, to be cut off from your plot, your tools, and your place in the local economy was a condemnation to a life of perilous uncertainty and likely starvation. This wasn't merely losing a job, it was the complete and total revocation of your economic identity. A farmer lost his right to till the soil he may have spent a lifetime cultivating. A blacksmith was forever barred from the forge that was both his workshop and his family's legacy. A baker could no longer sell her bread in the market, and a merchant lost all access to his network of trusted customers and suppliers. The community's protection extended to economic life, and without it, an individual was not only homeless but also hopeless, adrift in an economic wilderness with no way to earn a living or secure food and shelter. The rituals themselves were meticulously designed to drive this point home with brutal, symbolic clarity. The economic severance was made horrifically tangible for all to see. In many regions, part of the ceremony involved the public destruction or redistribution of the offender's livelihood. A plow might be shattered, a weaver's loom burned, or a craftsman's tools deliberately broken and scattered. This act was far more than petty vengeance. It was a powerful piece of economic theater. It visually demonstrated the permanent end of the individual's role in the local economy, ensuring they could never simply return and resume their trade. For the watching community, it was a stark reminder that their own economic security was tied to good standing within the group, making the consequences of transgression terrifyingly concrete. Furthermore, the disposition of the exiled person's property was a crucial part of the process, often serving as a powerful incentive for the community to uphold the verdict. Their land, their home, and their movable goods did not simply vanish. Typically, these assets were forfeit to the local lord or were divided among the community members according to local custom. This created a direct economic stake for everyone in maintaining the sentence. If the banished individual were to return, it wouldn't just be a social disruption. It would mean someone else might have to give up the field they were now farming or the cottage they were now living in. This web of new economic interests acted as a powerful enforcement mechanism, making the entire community financially invested in ensuring the exile remained permanent. The economic punishment, therefore, rippled outwards, binding the community together in a shared material interest in upholding the court's decision, long after the ritual itself was over. This understanding of the complete economic annihilation that accompanied banishment is the final piece of the puzzle that explains its unparalleled power as a deterrent. The fear of social shame was potent, and the terror of spiritual damnation was overwhelming, but the immediate prospect of destitution for oneself and one's family was a visceral, undeniable reality. It transformed the abstract concept of justice into a matter of cold, hard survival. a person might risk the wrath of their neighbors or even the displeasure of their God, but few would willingly choose a path that guaranteed the loss of everything that put bread on the table and a roof overhead. The economic stakes made the threat of banishment utterly credible and deeply personal for every member of that society, from the wealthiest landholder to the poorest serf, ensuring that this ritual, above all others, held the power to command absolute obedience to the communal will. This deep fusion of faith and law meant that a banishment ritual was never just a social or legal event. It was a profound spiritual transaction, a moment where the community actively enlisted divine power to enforce its earthly judgment. The sacred objects brought into the courtroom or town square, a priest's Bible, a fragment of a saint's bone encased in a reliquary, a simple wooden cross, were not mere props for atmosphere. They were believed to be active conduits to the divine, instruments that transformed the space into a sacred arena where heaven itself was watching. Their presence fundamentally altered the psychology of the proceeding for everyone involved. For the judges and the assembled community, it was a sobering reminder that they were not acting alone. Their verdict was being witnessed and sanctioned by a higher power, which placed a heavy burden of righteousness upon their shoulders. A wrongful condemnation performed in the presence of a holy relic was thought to invite divine wrath upon the entire community, not just the individual. This belief acted as a powerful, albeit imperfect, check against purely corrupt or biased judgments. For the accused, these objects were utterly terrifying. To lie while touching a Bible or to swear a false oath over a relic was to gamble with one's immortal soul, a risk far greater than any earthly punishment. This immense psychological pressure was a potent tool for extracting what was believed to be the truth in the absence of forensic evidence. One common practice involved having the accused swear an oath of innocence upon the sacred object. The physical act of touching the Bible or the reliquary during the oath was believed to bind the speaker to absolute truth, with perjury resulting in eternal damnation. If they were subsequently found guilty, their punishment was thus not just for the crime itself, but for the compounded, unforgivable sin of lying before God. Perhaps the most potent example of this fusion was the equation of civic banishment with religious excommunication, particularly in Christian-dominated regions. To be cast out by the Lord's court was bad enough, but to be simultaneously excommunicated by the Church was a punishment of catastrophic completeness. Excommunication was the spiritual mirror of outlawry. It severed the individual from the body of the faithful, denying them the sacraments essential for salvation. They could no longer attend Mass, receive communion, or be given last rites. Upon death, they could not be buried in consecrated ground, condemning their soul to an uncertain, perilous fate. This dual exile meant the offender was shut out from both the community of men and the community of God. They were isolated in the present and damned in the future, with no refuge in this world or the next. The rituals often made this double severance visually explicit. A priest might be present to turn a crucifix away from the condemned or to close a Bible with finality. In some ceremonies, a bell would be tolled slowly as for a funeral, symbolizing the spiritual death of the individual even as they were physically cast out. This intertwining of spiritual and temporal authority created a perfectly enclosed system of control. The Lord provided the legal framework and the physical enforcement, while the Church provided the moral justification and the eternal consequences. A judgment felt irrevocable because it was backed by the highest authority imaginable. There was no court of appeals in heaven for a banishment sanctified by a sacred relic. This made the punishment incredibly efficient. The exiled individual was shunned completely, as aiding them could be seen by the common person as defying not only the Lord's order but God's will itself. The sacred object, therefore, acted as the ultimate seal on the proceedings, transforming a social exile into a spiritual outlaw, condemned by their community and abandoned by their creator, left utterly alone in a world they believed was filled with divine and earthly threats. But the power of these rituals extended far beyond the courtroom and the town square, finding a permanent home in the vibrant world of medieval art and literature. It is here, in the pages of illuminated manuscripts and the stone carvings of cathedrals, that we discover how these practices were woven into the very fabric of the cultural imagination, shaping how people felt about justice, belonging, and exile long after the specific event was forgotten. These creative depictions were not mere records, they were powerful tools for teaching moral lessons and reinforcing the social order, ensuring that the emotional and symbolic weight of banishment was understood by everyone, from the illiterate peasant to the educated noble. Consider the epic poems and chivalric romances that were recited in great halls across Europe. These stories often turned on the dramatic axis of exile and return. The Old English epic Beowulf opens with the founder of the Danish royal line, Scyld Seefing, arriving as a child alone in a boat, a mysterious outcast who rises to become a great king. His grandson, Hrothgar, later builds Heorot, a hall meant to be a sanctuary from the terrors of the outside world, only to have it besieged by the monstrous Grendel, who is himself described as a descendant of the exiled biblical Cain, forever condemned to wander the wilderness. This layered narrative brilliantly uses the theme of banishment to explore the fragile line between community and chaos, suggesting that even the greatest societies are built by those who were once cast out and are perpetually threatened by the forces of exclusion. Perhaps the most poignant literary exploration is the tragic story of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, where the threat of ritualized violence and potential exile hangs over the entire narrative. Gawain's journey is a direct result of his agreement to a deadly game, and his honor, his very identity as a knight of the Round Table, depends on fulfilling his oath to seek out the Green Knight and receive a blow in return. The poem is a masterclass in the psychological dread of impending judgment. When Gawain finally arrives at the Green Chapel, the setting itself feels like a place of pagan execution, and the ritualistic raising of the axe mirrors the solemn, deadly seriousness of a feudal court sentence. His eventual slight failure of honesty results not in his death, but in a symbolic wound and, more importantly, in a profound sense of personal shame and alienation from his own ideal self. He returns to Camelot not as a triumphant hero, but as a man marked by his failure, wearing the green girdle as a public badge of his dishonor, a permanent reminder of his brush with social and spiritual exile. The Church, as the great patron of art, also ensured that the consequences of moral banishment were visible to every parishioner. Above the doors of countless medieval cathedrals, in the tympanum carved in stone, the scene of the Last Judgment played out in terrifying detail. Here, the ultimate divine banishment was depicted for all to see, the Archangel Michael weighing souls, with the saved being welcomed into the heavenly city on one side, and the damned being forcibly cast down into the jaws of hell on the other. This was the cosmic mirror of the earthly rituals. The demons dragging the condemned into hell were the supernatural equivalent of the bailiffs escorting an offender to the parish boundary. This artistic motif taught a clear, unforgettable lesson. The community's act of casting someone out was a mere reflection of God's final, eternal judgment. It sanctified the earthly practice by linking it directly to divine justice, making social exile a preview of spiritual damnation. Even the stained glass windows and frescoes inside churches told stories of exile and redemption. The tale of the prodigal son who demanded his inheritance and was effectively banished from his family's grace only to return in shame and be forgiven was a popular subject. This story served as a counterpoint to the permanence of criminal banishment, offering a narrative of conditional return and reconciliation that reinforced the Christian value of mercy, but only after a period of suffering and isolation. These artistic representations ensured that the concepts of judgment, shame, and exclusion were not abstract legal ideas, but were embedded in the visual and narrative language of everyday life, constantly reinforcing the idea that to break the community's trust was to step out of the light and into a darkness both physical and spiritual. Yet the echoes of those ancient rituals did not fade into silence with the crumbling of feudal walls. They merely found new forms, whispering through the very structures of our modern world. Consider the practice of deportation, a power wielded by the nation-state. While framed in the legal language of immigration policy and border security, its core mechanism is strikingly familiar: the formal, state-sanctioned removal of an individual from a defined community and its territory. A deportation order delivered on official letterhead and enforced by government agents is the modern equivalent of the Lord's writ of outlawry. It declares a person outside the protection of the law, in this case, the laws of a particular nation, and physically casts them out across a designated boundary line. The loss is just as profound: separation from home, family, livelihood, and the social fabric that provides identity and security. The ritual may be bureaucratic, stripped of its sacred objects and public spectacle, but the existential outcome for the individual exile remains hauntingly similar. Perhaps the most direct parallel to the medieval communal experience is found in the digital town square of social media, in the phenomenon often termed cancel culture or online ostracism. This is not a punishment delivered from the top down by a central authority, but a bottom-up collective action that mirrors the participatory justice of the feudal Holmut. When a community online perceives a violation of its shared norms, whether ethical, political, or social, it can mobilize with breathtaking speed to enact a form of digital banishment. The accused is subjected to a torrent of public denunciation, a virtual version of the shameful procession. Their social capital, their followers, their platform, their reputation is dismantled, much like the destruction of a person's tools or property. The goal is exclusion, to deplatform them, to make them unemployable in their field, to sever their digital connections and silence their voice within that particular community. It is a ritual of exclusion performed on a global scale, driven by the same primal engine of communal outrage and the desire to police the boundaries of acceptable behavior. This continuity across centuries reveals something fundamental about human social organization. It seems we possess a deep, hardwired impulse to respond to transgressions not only by punishing the individual, but by performing a public ritual that reaffirms our group values for everyone else. The medieval village used a broken staff and a handful of dust. We used trending hashtags and viral condemnations. The tools have changed, but the underlying psychology, the desire to collectively shame, to exclude, and to draw a bright line between us and them, bears a startling resemblance. This isn't to equate the life-altering severity of state deportation with the social consequences of online shaming, but rather to recognize they are different points on the same spectrum of exclusionary practices that human societies naturally generate. This reflection forces us to ask a difficult and uncomfortable question: have we truly evolved beyond ritualistic punishment, or have we simply refined its presentation? Our modern legal systems pride themselves on objectivity, due process, and the protection of individual rights, a monumental ethical advancement from the mob justice of the past. Yet, in the court of public opinion, those safeguards often vanish. The online crowd, like the medieval village, can be swift, merciless, and unconcerned with nuance, evidence, or redemption. The lack of a formal ritual might actually make our modern exiles more terrifying in their ambiguity. There is no defined oath to swear, no specific act of penance to perform, and no clear path to remission. The banishment is often open-ended, a purgatorial state rather than a formally concluded sentence. Recognizing this thread connecting the feudal court to the smartphone screen is not an indictment of modern society, but an invitation to deeper self-awareness. It suggests that our urge to cast out is a persistent feature of community life, not a historical artifact. The challenge, then, is not to pretend we are above such impulses, but to consciously build systems both legal and social that balance our need for communal safety and moral boundaries with compassion, proportionality, and most importantly, a clear pathway back. The true measure of our progress may lie not in whether we banish, but in how we choose to forgive. What we have uncovered in this journey is that the banishment rituals of feudal courts were not the crude, superstitious practices of a backward age, but rather sophisticated social technologies meticulously designed to address the most fundamental human needs: the need for order, the need for belonging, and the need for meaning. These were not haphazard acts of cruelty, but carefully orchestrated ceremonies that balanced the authority of the Lord with the collective will of the community, all under the watchful eye of a moral and spiritual framework. They managed to achieve something remarkably complex without a single law school graduate or a page of written statute, relying instead on the power of collective memory, shared symbolism, and public participation. This system, for all its stark severity, was deeply intelligent, understanding that for justice to be truly effective, it had to be felt in the bones of every single person, not just reasoned in the mind of a single judge. The true genius of these rituals lay in their multifaceted purpose. They were not merely about punishment, they were about pedagogy, cohesion, and reaffirmation. Every oath sworn on a relic taught a lesson about the sanctity of truth. Every symbolic casting of dust reinforced the connection between the people and the land that sustained them. Every act of public shaming was a live rehearsal of the community's values, a powerful reminder of the cost of breaking the trust that bound them all together. In a world without prisons as we know them, these rituals were the ultimate deterrent because they targeted the whole person, their social standing, their economic survival, and their spiritual well-being. They transformed abstract legal concepts into visceral, unforgettable experiences that strengthened the social fabric for those who remained, even as they unraveled it for the one cast out. As we stand in our modern world of courtrooms, legal codes, and professional lawyers, it is tempting to view this history as a distant curiosity, a barbaric past we have long since evolved beyond. But to do so would be to miss the profound questions these rituals pose to us today. Our system prioritizes individual rights, procedural fairness, and objective evidence, laudable achievements without question. But in this professionalization, what have we perhaps lost? Have we, in creating a more impartial system, also created a more distant one, where the average citizen is a passive subject of the law rather than an active participant in its execution? The feudal model challenges us to consider whether justice can sometimes feel too remote, too bureaucratic, and too disconnected from the communal need for moral reckoning and healing. This is not a call to return to throwing dust or breaking staffs, but an invitation to reflect on the enduring human elements these rituals addressed. The growing restorative justice movement, for instance, seeks to reintroduce that element of dialogue and communal engagement, bringing victims, offenders, and the community together to repair harm. Our continued fascination with public apologies and social media call-outs reveals a deep, perhaps unmet, desire for a justice that is not just decided but also seen and felt. The history of banishment rituals shows us that for justice to have lasting power, it must resonate on a human level, connecting to our deepest instincts about fairness, belonging, and consequence. They remind us that the law is not just a system of rules, but a living, breathing expression of who we are and what we value as a society. Thank you for exploring this fascinating corner of the past with me. I would love to hear your thoughts on these ancient practices and their echoes in our modern world in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe for more adventures into history.